Does God care about small places? How can we faithfully serve Christ in a rural context? What is the future of the church in rural America? The Rural Ministry Podcast deals with questions like this and much more in the hopes of bringing practical resources and inspiring stories to help the church flourish in rural communities. Dr. Charlie Cotterman is the Executive Director at the Center for Rural Ministry, Assistant Professor of Biblical Studies at Grove City College, and the pastor of a rural church in Oil City, Pennsylvania. Join the conversation as we journey into the good things God is doing in small places. Well, welcome to a special standalone episode of the Rural Ministry Podcast. We wanted to get together today just to discuss some really important fresh data coming out of Lifeway Research. And by fresh, I mean this data was released today. So it doesn't get much more fresh than that, right? So I'm here with my usual co-host, Dr. Charlie Cotterman. Charlie's the Executive Director at the Center for Rural Ministry, Assistant Professor of Biblical Studies at Grove City College, and the pastor of Oil City Vineyard Church in Oil City, Pennsylvania. And joining us is an important voice from the Center for Rural Ministry, Dr. Adam Loretto. Adam is Assistant Director at the Center for Rural Ministry and the Associate Professor of English and Writing at Grove City College. Adam, welcome to the show.
Good morning.
It's great to have you.
Really glad to have you, Adam. I think it's going to be great to hear your take on this. I know you've kind of been the one on our team who's been the deepest into this research. And I was thinking maybe the first thing we should do is maybe have you tell us a little bit, explain the study, because this is going to be, and this is a standalone. We wanted to get it out the day of the research came out. But I will say we're going to actually ask some other partners in this to share along the way on some other podcasts too down the road. So stay tuned. We'll tell you a little more about that. And when Adam talks about it, I'm sure that their names and our partners will come up. But I also thought, Adam, it might be good for you to tell us why even do research. There's a lot of need in rural areas already. Like everyone's busy serving like the needs in front of them. Why take the time to do something like this? So what is this project and why do research at all, I guess?
Yeah, so with this project, we recognized that there have been plenty of studies about the state of the church in America in lots of different ways, but none of them have been specific to rural churches and rural places. And so there's a lot we just don't know about how the state of the church is and where there are challenges, where there are hopes. And so we haven't had just that good picture for a long time. There have certainly been calls from other people in this space to try and do something like this. Pretty well-known figure these days is Ryan Burge. We've had conversations with him in the last couple of years, even where he said he would love to see data that's specific to rural pastors and rural places, just so we can be able to talk with more knowledge about where churches are and what their needs are and how things are going. And so this has been in progress now for about a year. We've worked with some partners at Wheaton. The Rural Church Institute at the Billy Graham Center at Wheaton College is one of our partners in this, as well as the Rural Home Missionary Association. We all came around this saying that with some resources available to us through the grants that we've been getting, we thought it would be really helpful just to be able to just get in front of pastors and hear what they're thinking, what they think the state of the church is, and then how that can help us know a little bit more about where to take some of our thoughts, our resources, our programming, as we're talking to pastors that we get to get in touch with.
Yeah. And I want to just emphasize how exciting it is that these partnerships are happening, because so many times we're in our own silos, or we're in this kind of like competitive spirit, even though we try to avoid it, like this organization that pitted against this. But this project, and we have a few others in the pipeline too, really are bringing people together. So this isn't like there are partners. We're all partners together, equal partners in this project. And I'm super excited about that. These organizations come together for the good of rural pastors and rural churches and rural places.
Yeah. And so, just having the ability to collaborate with each other around this and everyone kind of input on what kinds of questions we thought would be helpful. We all have some different focuses that we're looking at, but I think when it all comes together, it gives us a lot to really work with. And just the way this all came about and has come out so far. I mean, we got over 1,000 pastors on the phone. Lifeway Research did this work. Having 1,000 pastors on the phone, all of them in rural places all across the country, is pretty amazing. So we're really happy with that.
Yeah. So we're going to have Adam highlight a couple things that really stood out to him in just a minute. But I will say, stay tuned because we're going to have Jason McConnell at the Rural Church Institute at Wheaton's Billy Graham Center on in later episodes, and Adam Kipp, who leads the Rural Home Missionary Association. And both of those organizations are doing really cool things that are kind of like what we're doing, but also kind of different. And so they have their own personalities, even institutionally. So I can't wait to hear from them. But yeah, Adam, why don't you just get us going? If you could say, here's a couple things that really stood out, I just want to hit off the top. What would you say? What would be one of them?
We talk about calling a lot as we're thinking about how to talk to students about why we pastor or why people pastor as they do and where they pastor. We've thought about it a lot. We've had speakers talking about it. So that was one of the questions that came up in this survey was, how do pastors think of their calling when it comes to, why they're in a rural church? Is it just kind of a general calling of God's called me to be a minister, I'll go wherever? Is it I know I'm called to be a pastor in rural places in particular? They sense that kind of leading, or is it just, this is the church that called me, and so I'm here because God through this church called me to this particular church? And so that was what we were trying to wonder a little bit there. And so out of that, 63% of the pastors that took this survey said that they were called to ministry in the particular church that they were in, and that happens to be in a rural or small town. 24% said they thought that they were called to ministry in a rural or small town community, that was sort of their vocation, whatever church they ended up calling it, answering a call to, that would be the place they would expect to go. 9% said they didn't sense any particular calling to rural or small town communities, and 5% said they just weren't sure if they were called to rural or small town communities. So we found that pretty interesting that so many of them contextualized their calling specifically to their church where they were currently serving.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating thing to think about, because, well, of these 1,000 rural pastors, it is interesting that about 250 of them said, I actually know that I'm called to small places and small communities. So, that's a quarter isn't significant amount that say no, I just know I'm called to these places. Maybe it's the giftings they have. Maybe they just feel like I'm really good in a group of 50 to 100. God's given me some really relational skill sets. Maybe it's affinities. They just like small communities and they just feel like God's called them into that. But the other thing that this says is that there are a lot of people in small communities that are there because this specific church is the church that called them and they feel called to. And so, they're not there necessarily because they like the context. They're there because God's called them to this one place. And so that's an interesting dynamic too. So if that's 60%, it means that there's a lot of folks who they might not even be from rural places. They might not have a special affinity to it, but they're serving there. Maybe it's sacrificially for some of them. Maybe they, this isn't what they like, 9% no specific calling. The other thing that can happen, though, is you can actually fall in love with places, right?
And that's what stands out to me, maybe with that 63%. I don't know that you would respond as a yes to that question about a specific church unless you develop this, mutual relationship, right? That seems to be healthy.
Absolutely. And the other thing I think that we don't see in the question, the way it seems to have been asked, is, a person might feel called to a specific rural community, but not to rural communities in general. So, for instance, when Amy and I were discerning a call to come back to Well City and plant a church, I wasn't saying I didn't sense that God was saying, you have to go to a small place anywhere. I sense God was saying, this small place, this small community is where you were supposed to go. And I don't know if the question quite gets at that dynamic of it, that, some callings are very specific to a certain place, but you wouldn't say necessarily, I'm called to any rural place or just to rural places, because then rural becomes super like big and hard to nail down. Like there's no one rural America. So what's that even mean?
Yeah, well, Lifeway did kind of look into this a little bit, and they said, about 70% of pastors who are currently rural pastors, but also grew up in an urban area, said that they were called to a particular church, right? And so again, it gets to that idea of, God's will do what it's going to do, right? You don't necessarily know what that's going to look like, but we definitely have talked a lot about why that sense of call matters, right? We had Dean Weaver at our conference last year saying, look, pastoring is going to be tough, ministry is going to be tough. How you understand your call is what helps anchor you in some of those really tough things. And so we're hopeful that, right, in the responses that we're getting from these pastors, that sense of call is strong enough that whatever their conception of it, as they get into the challenges of pastoring, they can look at that and say, no, right, I know I'm in the will of God here in what I'm doing.
Absolutely. Right. And the other thing about that, I would say too, is even if a person feels called to a church, unless you're called to like First Presbyterian Church of the Internet, you're called to like a place, right? You're like First Presbyterian of, like there is a way in which every calling to a specific church is also a calling to a specific community that church is in. So that could be secondary, but it's definitely a part of it. And I'm thinking about calling, I'm thinking about some other things I know you've talked about with this research, like inspiration, so calling in what inspires you to be a pastor, kind of those things do often go together. Was there some information you had about like the inspirations of what lead people into this kind of ministry?
Yeah, so that question was framed as which, if any of the following, inspire you to be a pastor in a rural or small town? And so we kind of gave them a list of options based on some kind of pre-research that had been done. And so the top three that came out of that were seeing someone take a step toward Jesus, seeing the potential to make a difference, and getting to preach God's word. Those were all well over 90% of all the pastors that took the survey agreed with those three ideas. And right, frankly, those should sound like pretty much what any pastor would say, I would think. Right?
Yeah, that's what jumps out to me.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I will say, though, I do think the second one, seeing the potential to make a difference, we've talked about this before, Garrett and I on this podcast, like is a way in which the kind of smaller social network of a small place, the way it's integrated, you actually can, I think, see like the difference you're making as a small church in a smaller community a little bit more clearly, and maybe a little bit more regularly than in a large place. So I think there is something about that bit that maybe does like lean in the direction of small town ministry specifically. But of course, like we want all pastors, all of us who serve the church, whether we're pastors or lay leaders, want to see people take steps toward Jesus. That's what it is about. And getting to preach the word, I mean, that doesn't surprise me. That is something that pastors value, and we're glad about that, right?
Yeah. There were some others that are a little bit more contextual as well. So 91% said serving in their local community was a big part of what inspired them to pastor. 81% said being present for everyday activities in their community was a big part of just doing ministry and being in life in a community. And then 80% still said enjoying the pace of rural life was one of the reasons they liked to pastor there. And probably gets to that idea of relational kind of work that you've already mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm still trying to figure out what the pace of rural life is. Side note that I don't know. Sometimes rural life.
Your rural pace is pretty quick.
So all this stuff about the slow pace of rural life, I'm still trying to figure out how to get there. But yeah,
those are the Wendell Berry readers there.
That's right.
Yeah, the number 3.
That's why I listen to Wendell Berry books in my car when I drive from one place to another. Oh. Now, one thing that always comes up when we talk about rural ministry, and it makes sense, but honestly, it should be any ministry that we talk about, are the challenges, right? So I'm sure, in this survey, you all looked at some of the challenges that pastors face. maybe I'd be curious to know if there were any surprises or if there are any kind of things that kind of affirmed what you suspected. What showed up?
Well, I mean, if you've heard narratives of rural life and rural churches before, it's probably been lack of resources, all of that kind of thing. And so finances was one of the ones that we put on the list, financial limitations. 44% of all pastors who took the survey picked that one, and it certainly was not the highest. And so I think that helps a little bit to just think that, certainly not all rural churches are the same in that way, right? There's a whole range of what constitutes a rural church, and different sizes, different financial capabilities, and so in that sense, right, that's helpful to see that there are a lot of different kinds of churches, and so some of the churches feel like they're very stable, they're well resourced, and they're able to work effectively in their community. Now, right, again, we were talking to pastors from all kinds of different ranges of churches, and so 54% of pastors who have congregations of 50 or less did select finances as one of their challenges. And so that maybe makes a little bit more sense, right? But again, it does show that, this isn't all a monolith for sure.
Well, and I remember seeing some of the breakouts from the data. And one of the things that was nice, Lifeway kind of highlighted the differences between smaller churches, larger churches, churches with a budget over 300,000 or churches with a smaller budget, because it really isn't just the same for everyone. They're really, even in the same town across the street, even it could be a different experience for a church.
And certainly some of those realities of things like finances will change quite a bit about, the pastor's life and time as that's spent. I know you talked to probably Adam Kipp about that a little bit more later, but, the reality of, am I able to draw a full-time salary from this church and therefore, right, kind of be engaging in, outreach in the community all the time, or am I working 40 hours a week at some other job? And of course, you can still be doing ministry in that context, but it just changes a little bit of how you assess what you're able to do, for sure. But with that comes, all right, so how are the congregation at large doing when it comes to helping lead ministry within the church? And so one of the options for pastors to choose about challenges in the church was leadership development, and that was the one that hit the highest. And that's, again, something we've been pretty aware of in a lot of ways. So 60% of pastors who took this survey said that leadership development was an issue that they were working on. Right. And so we know that there's a high level of activity among a lot of church members. Other questions asked about that a lot of church members are serving in their congregation, in their community. So it's not necessarily just that there isn't anyone doing the work, but maybe it's something about how pastors feel about decision making within the church, or how the church is being led through the membership.
Yeah, and I think this is one, we have heard this from the very beginning of our work with the Project on Rural Ministry, like 7 years ago. I know as a pastor, I've wrestled with this one, and I don't think that it's just small churches either wrestling with this, but I do think in small churches, we tell ourselves certain stories about why it's especially hard for us. And sometimes they're true and sometimes they're excuses. So I think we say like, well, there just aren't leaders here, or there just aren't people with these skills here. And that is sometimes true. And also it's true that we can build them up. I know we've talked about this in other podcasts. We'll probably keep talking about this. There are ways that you can serve quicker in a small place that actually helps you become a leader in ways you might not in a larger place. But it's definitely something to pay attention to. Like, are we, being, like we just said in a recent podcast, attentional, and intentional about finding leaders and asking them to serve? And maybe there are some real systems and things. I know sometimes we think rural churches, there's no systems or things, but no, maybe there's a process that actually does help. And then the other thing I was thinking when I saw that one was that we all follow this guy, Jesus, who he had a little bit of trouble with leadership development, and it wasn't his fault, right? But it is sometimes hard to develop leaders. It took him 3 years with these guys, and they're still making mistakes by the end. So kind of if we're trying on leadership development and we're running into some hurdles, we might be in good company.
Yeah, fair enough.
Well, and it's no wonder, I think, that even so far in the podcast, this may be our primary topic. I mean, certainly in our guest interviews as well, this is going to come up a lot. But it's no surprise to me We've hit on even the importance of having some imagination, right, in this regard, in a prior episode. But also, I just wonder, like, the expectations. I think anybody in ministry carries these expectations of what they think their ministry should look like, and that's not just their own giftings, right? This is also about the people around them and what the structure and leadership of their church looks like. So you can easily have this expectation that that bar is up pretty high, but that's not always what God gives us, right?
I think it's fair to say that, for some pastors, there can be, a little bit of how much control am I willing to give over on some of this, right?
Yeah.
There's a desire for leadership, but then there's also a sense of, well, sometimes it's easier if I do it myself, or I know it'll get done the right way. And that's something that everyone faces in any kind of work situation, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Well, and as I'm looking over our show notes here, I'm noticing, like, could you talk about signs of success? Because I think it actually does speak to this, Adam, a little bit. So you saw some signs of success in this data. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, again, just a list of options here. And so 97% of all pastors said that they are seeing members of their congregation showing care within the church. And 90% said that they are seeing members consistently present. Those are the top two kind of highest choices that pastors made, that these are things that they are seeing regularly in their congregation, which, right, I think says that we are seeing commitments happening within church. We're seeing people definitely connecting within congregations, and these are great to see. What do you think would motivate those as kind of the two highest selections within the church?
Well, like, this is what's fascinating, and this is one of the reasons why I'm just making a plug here for research and the work Adam's doing in this team, because if we know that one of the challenges, maybe the highest, right, the highest challenge pastors say they face is leadership development, right? And then we see that the biggest sign of success is members showing care, that 97% of pastors say that they're showing care, and 90% say their members show up. To me, it seems like there are leaders doing leadership things there. And maybe, because, like, honestly, showing care to the body, like the body taking care of the body, that is every pastor's hope. That is like what we see in the Bible. That's leadership. Like when they had to get Stephen and Philip, to take care of the widows in early in Acts, like, they were leaders. They took care of the body, right? So there's something interesting here, a disconnect between, and I think it's what Garrett said, maybe, a disconnect between what we think leaders have to do and be and know, and what, like, leaders are actually doing right now. And there might be just the way we think and talk and imagine it might not be matching reality or what's even needed in our church. So that's something that's worth digging into as we go forward.
Well, I want to point out too that back to the challenges for a second, only 36% of pastors thought that their churches were too inward focused, right? So again, that idea of showing care, right, that could be interpreted as they're showing care for the congregation and their fellow kind of churchgoers, but it could mean right within the community as well, right? A lot of these pastors are saying that they think their churches are outwardly focused, which is another thing that we see as a great sign.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a good observation for sure.
It's comforting, I think, when I look at these numbers too, like members showing care, 97%, members consistently present, 90%. This is just really simply about, like, being the body of Christ, right? And it's not surprising to me that in a rural context that you would see numbers that are that high. It's what it's all about, really. And this flies in the face, I think, of even some cultural trends that we see. Maybe there's a distinction here between rural and urban. I don't know. But, some of these trends where people are, especially younger people, kind of going away from the church, especially church attendance, even if they may believe all the right things. There's certainly a trend that young people aren't going to church as often. But, like, seeing these numbers is really encouraging, I think. Yeah,
you don't have to look too far to see, like, there have been some really interesting signs of just the Spirit moving in all kinds of populations. And so it's nice to see even kind of the rural churches across the nation, right? This survey all across the nation, all denominations of Protestantism here represented. So this is not any particular stripe of Protestantism being surveyed here. All of them are saying, like, we think that there's some good things happening, right? We really were, on the whole, pretty impressed by where pastors thought the church was. And right, I think it aligns with other stories that you're hearing of just God's Spirit moving among the population. And that's really been good to see.
Yeah. And even honestly, even like that, the younger generation, there's starting to be some data coming out that like they're starting to come back around to church in a kind of in energizing, fresh way. So we'll see what happens in the next 5 years. And maybe that's a good way to kind of land this conversation, Adam. Is there a reason to think that pastors are hopeful about what the future holds for rural ministry?
Yeah, so a couple of things, right? 75% of the pastors that took this, right? So over 750 out of 1,000 pastors said that they're seeing new commitments to Jesus in their church, right? And that's great. Like this, we didn't specifically ask for childhood commitments or adult conversions and commitments, but these are good signs, right? 75% of churches say that they're seeing this, and 88% of the pastors that we surveyed said that they think that their church will be stronger in 10 years than it is now, right? Again, these signs that there's hope here, that they're really encouraged by the work and how people are responding.
Just to reiterate, 88% of pastors think their church will be stronger in 10 years than it is today.
Look at that optimism, right?
Yeah, really. I mean, that is not the narrative that's out there. The narrative that's out there is rural pastors are there because they have to be, because they couldn't find anywhere else. It's kind of like, a hard ministry that no one really wants to do. Woe is me. But no, when we talk to 1,000 rural pastors, 880 or so say they think their church will be stronger in 10 years than it is today. And that kind of optimism, I mean, I don't even want to call it optimism. I want to call it hope.
It's hope. Yeah.
We have a God who loves churches everywhere, loves people everywhere, and can work anywhere. And it seems like pastors truly believe that, which is what we hope for and what we're seeing. So there's reasons to be encouraged by even how pastors feel. Now, you might be listening to this podcast and you might say, that's not how I feel. And believe me, I even personally know pastors that don't feel that kind of optimism. I mean, we've seen churches closing recently, even in my neck of the woods. And we want to say, that's where we hope you find some community. We'd love to be part of that community at the Center for Rural Ministry. I mean, ministry is hard no matter where you are. And maybe some of you are saying, well, when I hear that, it makes me more depressed that everyone's feeling optimistic and I'm not. So I just want you to know there are, that does mean that there's a number of pastors who don't think that, right? And so there's also company there. And we just want you to know that there are places, and we hope we can be one of those places at the Center for Rural Ministry where you can connect with folks. Because I think we need to be connected to folks all along the spectrum. We rejoice with those who are rejoicing. We mourn with those who mourn. That's the call of the church.
I think that's a good wrap for this. I'm looking forward to some more of these conversations that we'll have kind of surrounding this data that's coming out. But it's kind of cool to jump into initial impressions. Mm-hmm. Anything that jumps out to us is a lesson to learn. So, Adam, thanks for joining us here today. And thank you, everybody, for listening. We hope this conversation has provided you with some encouragement. I know it has for me, actually. Maybe even a practical idea for your own ministry context. The Rural Ministry Podcast is part of the good work being done at the Center for Rural Ministry at Grove City College. So if you found this podcast helpful, there are a few free things you can do to help us out. First, share this episode with a friend or colleague who could benefit from it. Second, you can leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. This helps more people discover our show. And lastly, leave us a comment or suggestion on the episode page over at the Center for Rural Ministry YouTube channel. We hope to get some good conversations started over there as well. Thanks for listening. You can learn more about our mission by visiting www.ruralministry.org. Have a great week.